A billionaire was sitting in a fancy restaurant in the middle of New York. He laughed as he looked at the Black Waitress who was placing a glass of water on the table and said, "Hey, give me some financial advice. Let's see what you know about money." Who would have thought, just a few seconds later, that girl would say words that made the room fall silent and then changed his whole life? A seemingly small statement shook the pride of the man who once held $1 billion empire. A chance encounter between the most powerful and the most despised person, and then they both realized that not everyone who is poor lacks intelligence, and not everyone who is rich is truly happy. Have you ever been looked down upon because of your appearance, your skin color, or your position in society? Do you have the courage to stand up to those who look down on you, not with anger, but with wisdom and kindness? And are those who once had it all willing to give up everything to find themselves? This story is not just about a disrespectful joke, but the journey of awakening of two people on opposite sides of the world. A glass of water, a sentence, and a whole life changed. Please like and share before watching the story below. In late autumn, the wind in New York carried a chilly breeze between the tall glass buildings. People still hurried along Fifth Avenue as if they had never known fatigue. In a warm corner of Manhattan, the Glass Ember restaurant glowed like amber in the middle of the night. It served not only food, but also the feeling of belonging to the upper class. Amara Lewis adjusted her apron and examined the tray of glasses in her hands. Each glass glowed under the lamplight as if it had a soul of its own. It had been 5 months since she had started working here. Years standing amid the glittering light of the world she once belonged to, and now only seen from the outside. She studied finance. She worked in an investment firm, analyzing charts like breathing, but life doesn't promise anything long-term. After the incident, Amara left everything behind, took her sick mother to rent a small apartment in Harlem, medical debt, medicine. Rent, all of it forced her to work extra night shifts, standing for 10 hours a day. Yet, she remained strangely calm. Her voice was soft, her smile gentle, her eyes deep. No one knew that behind that calmness was a locked storm. Tonight, Table 12 was reserved for a special group of guests. The man in the middle, tall, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a dark blue suit, was James Cartwright, a billionaire investor known for his blunt and arrogant personality. The press called him the Iron Fist of Wall Street, but the waiter whispered the king without a smile. Amara had heard of him before, in hundreds of newspaper articles and bar conversations, but actually meeting him was different. The way James held his drink, the way he scanned people like he was appraising property made everyone wary. She walked up to the table, keeping her voice polite. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Amara. I'll be serving you tonight. Would you like some water first?" James did not look up, still in the middle of a conversation with his German partner. Laughter rang out, knives and forks clinked. As she poured water near him, James stopped suddenly, turned around, his voice laced with mockery. "This girl seems smart," he said, half smiling. "How about some financial advice over this drink?" The whole table burst into laughter, a thick, smoke-like laugh. Someone even tapped the table, amused. Amara paused. She still held the cold water jug, droplets rolling from the rim onto her hand. The air around her seemed to freeze. For a second, she could have chosen to remain silent like so many times before. Smile, lower her head, and continue with her work. But that laugh, the way he said the word "this girl" as light as air, yet as heavy as stone, made her hear a world of prejudice in it. She looked up. "Okay, sir." Amara's voice was deep but clear, each word ringing out in the luxurious space. "If I had to advise you, I would say invest 40% in renewable energy funds in Southeast Asia, 25% in medical technology stocks, especially those in gene therapy, 20% in commercial real estate funds in the Midwest that are restructuring infrastructure, 10% in agricultural commodities as an inflation hedge, and 5% in cash for short-term arbitrage opportunities." She paused, setting the water jug down so gently that it made no sound. The room was dead silent. A customer dropped his knife on his plate. The small sound rang out clearly, like the ringing of a bell. James looked at her. For the first time that evening, he really looked at her. His eyes were no longer smiling. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low. Amara tilted her head. Still calm. "You asked about investing. I just answered. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then no one said anything more." She turned away and continued pouring drinks for other tables. Her light steps, as if she had never done anything, made the whole restaurant hold its breath. Behind him, James continued to watch, his face cold. He was not used to this feeling being silenced by an insignificant person. The German partner coughed slightly, then smiled awkwardly. "She seems knowledgeable." "James," he smiled, a forced smile. "It's just nonsense. They read a few lines on the internet and think they understand the market." But his voice was no longer certain. After the customers left, the restaurant was down to a few tables. Amara cleared away the glasses, her hands tired. She sat down on a chair in the corner of the kitchen, opened her phone, and checked the time. It was almost midnight. On the screen, a message notification appeared. "Mom is fine. Don't worry." She smiled slightly, but in her heart, the feeling still lingered. Not because she was offended, but because she felt pity. I pity people like James, people who believe that power can define intelligence, that money can buy all respect. She took a deep breath, stood up, and went back to wiping the counter. Outside, luxury cars passed by the glass. Each light told a story. And she told herself, "I will not let this world forget me." But deep in those calm eyes, there was something that even Amara had not yet realized. The moment James Cartwright laughed at her was also the moment fate took a slight turn. A joke and a fire started in silence. The laughter from table 12 echoed in Amara's head all night long, even though the restaurant was closed. She wiped the table again, as if to erase the trace of contempt that lingered in the air. Outside, the street lights were still lit. The yellow lights stretched along the avenue, creating a shimmering strip of light. But her heart felt strangely hazy. Amara wasn't angry, at least not in the way one might expect. Her anger didn't explode. It just lay dormant. She was used to people like James Cartwright, people who thought the checks they wrote made them superior. But tonight, there was something in his eyes that reminded her of the past, a very old feeling, the feeling of knowing too much and yet being forced to keep quiet. She changed out of her uniform, put on an old sweater, and left the restaurant. The night wind blew through her collar, carrying the damp smell of the Hudson River. Her small apartment in Harlem was only a few miles away, but the night train made the journey seem longer. She sat by the window of the train, watching her reflection in the glass. In the dim light, her face was dark and eerily calm. "I'm fine, Mom," she whispered to herself, as was her habit. When she got home, the small room was only about 300 square feet. Her mother was sleeping soundly, breathing evenly but weakly. The oxygen concentrator hummed softly beside the bed. Amara pulled the covers over her mother and sat down by the window. Outside, the sky was a dull gray. She opened an old notebook and turned to the page containing the investment return formulas she had written. The writing was slightly blurred from her own tears many years ago. She still remembers the day she was fired from Kingsdale Investment. She had presented a data analytics model that could predict market trends, but the director who had taken credit for her work blamed her for insider trading. There was no evidence of guilt, but no one stood by her. An accusation that required no evidence, just prejudice, and she was cast out of that world, a world where a black woman's voice was not believed. That night, she turned on her phone again. The message from the restaurant manager simply said she did well, but next time, avoid arguing with important customers. Amara let out a small laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it wasn't bitter either. Avoid arguing, it was like an unwritten rule for all waiters: keep quiet, smile, bear it. But deep down, she knew she had taken a different step. Her words, her response, were not just for self-defense. They were a sign that a part of her that had been buried was coming back to life. The next morning, the city woke to the sound of car horns and people shouting in the street. Amara poured herself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table in the corner. On the table was the financial newspaper she bought every week, even though she no longer worked in the industry. The headline read, "Cartwright Capital continues to expand investments in Asia." She stared at the text, silent. There was something in James's eyes last night that haunted her surprise, mixed with confusion, as if someone had seen his weakest side for the first time. She knew he wouldn't let it go easily. He wasn't used to being challenged. The phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Amara hesitated, then picked up. "Amara Lewis," a deep male voice said. "This is Peter, Mr. Cartwright's assistant. He wants to apologize if you were offended." She looked surprised, but the other person's voice was steady. "Mr. Cartwright said you could come to the restaurant tonight. He wants to talk again." Amara looked out the window. The morning breeze carried the scent of coffee and dust. Part of her wanted to refuse, but the other part was curious. "I will come," she replied shortly. At night, the glass ember lit up again. This time, James sat alone at table 12. No business partners, no laughter. He looked up when she approached. "Thanks for coming back," he said, his voice calm but his eyes searching. "I was a little too harsh last night. Just curious. Where did you learn to understand finance so well?" Amara smiled slightly. "I only went to a small school. The rest is self-taught." James nodded, but his eyes showed disbelief. "You know," he continued, "in this world, people only get listened to if they have degrees and fame. You should know that." She replied softly, "I know, but sometimes the truth doesn't need degrees to exist." The air was heavy. He looked at her longer than necessary. "You're different from the others I've met," he said quietly, almost unconsciously. "Maybe because I don't try to be like them." She replied, her eyes calm. After a brief conversation, Amara left the table, but a strange feeling lingered with her. There was something about James's demeanor that made her uncomfortable, as if he were calculating, not just curious. She stepped into the galley, her hands shaking slightly. She couldn't tell if the emotion was fear or wariness. Last night it had been contempt. Tonight it was false concern. Both left her cold when her shift ended. Amara left the restaurant in a light rain. She walked down the street, the rain hitting her shoulders, mixing with the neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Her mother's words echoed in her head. You can't change the way people see you, but you can choose how you see them. She stopped by the subway stairs, watching the rush of people. Maybe, she thought, she had chosen to stand still. But if the world only respected the powerful, perhaps it was time for her to stand up, once more. A cold wind blew. She pulled her coat closer, and in that moment, the thought flashed through her mind. If he wants to know about me, maybe I should know about him. She didn't know that at that very moment. The story between them, between the one who once mocked and the one who was once looked down upon, had just entered a new chapter. Monday morning, the early morning sun streamed through the glass walls of the Cartwright Capitol building on the 52nd floor. James's office was lit by the metallic reflection of the windows. On the desk, files were piled high. The computer screen was full of numbers, but he could see nothing. James's mind kept returning to the moment at the glass ember when the waitress had rattled off numbers so precisely that he felt threatened. It was unfamiliar. He'd met hundreds of people who considered themselves smart, but Amara's eyes were different. Calm, deep, fearless. The eyes of someone who had seen numbers not on paper, but in real life. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but the more he tried to forget, the more clearly the image returned. A man who had conquered the market could not bear to be swayed by a waiter. He rang the bell, calling his assistant in. "Peter," James said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep, "I want to know everything about her. Everything. Where she went to school, what she did, why she was a waitress." Peter hesitated. "Sir, we did a little research. Her name is Amara Lewis, 29 years old, lives in Harlem with her mother, no criminal record, no debts, attended community school, no financial records." James narrowed his eyes. "No way. No one can say that without understanding finance. Dig deeper." "I want to know the past." Peter nodded and left. Alone, James walked to the window and looked out at the city. In the distance, Central Park was a hazy gray-green. From above, New York looked small, but James knew in every one of those buildings were thousands of people who dreamed of the power he had. So why should he be troubled by a mere girl? He closed his eyes. The image of his father flashed before him, a poor mechanic who had once told him that money is the only thing that will make people listen to you. Perhaps because of that, James had spent his life proving his father right. He had climbed from the bottom of Wall Street, stepping on others to reach this peak. At 52, he believed he could control everything except this feeling. In the evening, Peter brought back a thin file. "Here's what else I found, sir." James flipped through the pages. The file contained a summary of Amara's employment as an assistant data analyst at Kingsdale Investment, leaving 4 years ago. No reason given. But there was one small detail: her name had appeared on a list of employees under investigation in an insider trading case. Then the file had been expunged. James paused. The Kingsdale affair. I remember. One of the companies that went bankrupt after the scandal that year. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the table. Interesting. James didn't go home that night. He stayed in his office, leaving only a small desk lamp on. In the dim light, he played back the recording of his conversation with Amara at the restaurant. Peter had secretly recorded it on the security camera system. Her voice echoed in the silent space. Invest 40% in renewable energy, 25% in medical technology. James listened again and again. There was something about the way she spoke that struck him. It was not a memorized way of speaking, but one that understood. She spoke as if she had read the reports, had lived with the numbers. He chuckled, a half smile. "Who are you?" "Amara Lewis." Outside, the clock read 2 in the morning. The city slept, and James sat there, his eyes fixed on the data stream on his screen. He opened the Kingsdale file again, looking for the names of people who had been involved. A note appeared: Lewis, Amara, forecasting analyst. Involvement unknown, voluntarily resigned. He read further, then stopped at an old report. There is a suspicion that internal data has been leaked from the analysis layer. James curled his lip. Maybe she was in on this game, and if so, she knows more than I thought. The next morning, Amara started her shift early. Unbeknownst to her, someone was turning the pages of her past. Everything was as usual: customers arriving, the clatter of knives and forks, the faint sound of jazz music. But from the last table, a strange man sat watching. Gray suit, gleaming watch, too neat to be a tourist, too quiet to be a real businessman. Amara suddenly realized something was wrong. The man's eyes were following her too closely, but she continued working, smiling, pouring water as usual. When her shift ended, the manager called her back. "Someone just left an envelope for you. They say it's from an old friend." Amara opened it. Inside was only a small piece of paper. "Be careful what you say. He is looking for you." At the bottom was a familiar signature: Elliot Tran. The name made her heart stop. Elliot, her old colleague at Kingsdale, the only person who had ever believed in her innocence. She sank into a chair, the paper shaking in her hand. "He's looking for me." Who? James Cartwright. For what reason, in her mind flashed the image of James, his eyes that night, his fragile smile. She understood he had not forgotten. He was digging deeper. Fear crept into her. But then a new wave of determination rose up. She had run away for too long. Maybe, this time, she wouldn't let anyone define her anymore. She put the paper in her pocket and walked out of the restaurant. The afternoon sunlight shone on her shoulders. Her steps were more determined than usual. In the distance, in the car, James looked out the window. He saw her figure disappearing into the crowd. A feeling of curiosity, amusement, and challenge rose up in him. He smiled faintly. "Fine. Amara Lewis," he muttered. "You want to play smart, see who wins." Unknown to both, the game, the battle between pride and intelligence, had officially begun. Silently, but unstoppably. The next morning, the sky over New York was hazy, gray clouds drifting silently over the skyscrapers. Amara sat in a small cafe on the corner of 139th and Lenox, where the worn wooden chairs, the smell of roasted coffee, and the soft music played. She still couldn't quite believe what had been written on the envelope the night before, but she had a feeling Elliot never lied. As the waiter put down her coffee cup, she nodded slightly in thanks, her gaze directed towards the glass door. People were still hurrying by. No one knew that in this small shop. There was a woman pondering whether to confront the man who had made her feel inferior or leave forever. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Amara Lewis Elliott's voice came quickly and quietly. "Elliott, is that you?" "Yes. Look, I don't have much time. I'm being watched. Cartwright Capital was involved in the Kingsdale insider business back then, and he's working his way back. If he knows you were there, you're in trouble." Amara paused. "What are you saying?" "Are you sure I checked the recent trades? His sub-funds are making the same trades Kingsdale did before the crash. Same pattern, same cover, only he's smarter this time." "Elliott? You mean he's breaking the law? I mean he's doing the same thing that got you screwed back then. And he knows about you. He wants to make sure you're not a threat." The phone rang. She sat still, her heart pounding. A wave of old emotions came rushing back, the feeling of being blamed, of her name appearing in the investigation file, of no one believing her. But this time was different. She was no longer the scared girl she had been. Amara held her coffee cup, watching the steam rise. A plan began to form in her mind. If James wanted to hunt her, she would let him think she was the prey. But in this game, the predator might not know the net had been set. The glass ember was busier than usual that evening. The yellow light reflected off the wine glasses, making the room glow. Amara went about her business as usual, expressionless. But she knew that, in the far corner of the restaurant, James was sitting, alone. He followed her every move, his eyes cold and sharp. He watched every step she took. When she poured water for the guests, he remembered the exact way that hand held the glass, the way she answered his questions with a confidence that kept him awake for a week. She felt his gaze, but instead of avoiding it, she deliberately approached his desk, smiling slightly. "Mr. Cartwright, how may I help you today?" He tilted his head. "You remember my name. I usually remember the names of special guests." His voice dropped. "And I don't forget those who embarrass me." At that moment, their eyes met like two blades, cold and bright. "You know I'm investigating you." "Amara," he said bluntly, his voice calm but somehow sinister. Amara held back a smile. "I guess so. Powerful people can't stand not understanding someone." "What do you do at Kingsdale Investment, she said softly. "Just a simple data analyst." "But that's not normal, is it?" James leaned forward. "You know, I don't like being led around. If you have a secret, you better tell me before I find it myself." She smiled slightly, her eyes unwavering. "Mr. Cartwright, sometimes what scares people is not other people's secrets, but their own truth." The tension in the air was like a string. He looked at her longer, then chuckled. "You are very smart, Amara, but smarts without purpose sometimes only make people miserable." "Maybe," she replied, "but sometimes it saves lives." She turned away, leaving James alone. He watched her, angry and curious. His pride began to turn to obsession. 2 days later, Peter walked into Cartwright Capital's office. His face tense. "You should see this." On the desk was a report compiled by the Internal Analysis Department, a series of unusual transactions involving Cartwright Capital's subsidiaries. Some of them matched exactly the trading pattern Amara had mentioned at their first dinner. James frowned. "Are you sure?" "Yes. Someone is watching our movements. There could be a leak." James was silent. The image of the girl with the deep, knowing eyes flashed through his mind. That evening, he drove to the restaurant, But Amara was no longer there. The manager said she had taken a few days off. James frowned. Off or in hiding? He left the restaurant and stood by the road watching the cars pass by. The cold wind cut across his face. He didn't understand why he felt uneasy. Meanwhile, in southern Manhattan, Amara sat in Elliot's small apartment. On the table was an old laptop, its screen displaying lines of encrypted data. "Here's the proof," Elliot said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "I traced the trades from Cartwright Capital. They match the codes Kingsdale used to manipulate the stock. Only someone inside the system could do that." Amara looked at the screen, her voice low. "Can we prove he used inside information?" "Yes, but we need one last piece of the puzzle, a recording or leaked data from him. If you can get it." She interrupted. "I know. He always keeps his phone on the table, on mute. If I get the chance." Elliot looked at her, worried. "Amara, don't do anything stupid. This is James Cartwright. He's not just rich, he's dangerous." She looked out the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Elliot, I lost everything because of my silence. Now, I just want the truth to be heard." Elliot sighed. "If you do, be careful. One mistake and you'll be crushed." Amara smiled, light as a breath. "I'm not afraid anymore. I've been to rock bottom, and I have nothing to lose." The next evening, James received a note from the restaurant. "Someone sent you a bottle of wine. It says, 'From Amara.'" He opened the bottle, and inside was a note. "It's interesting that you want to know about me, but sometimes it's scary when I know too much about you." James clenched the paper, feeling both angry and excited. He had never been challenged like this before. "This girl," he muttered. "She doesn't know who she's dealing with." But what James didn't know was that as soon as he put the paper down, the small camera embedded in the wine bottle cap activated, sending the image directly to Amara's phone. On the laptop screen, she saw him, powerful figure, cold eyes reading her note with a haughty smile. She said softly, almost in a whisper, "I know exactly who you are, James Cartwright, and this time you will not escape." Outside the window, New York fell into darkness. But for Amara, the night had only just begun. The New York morning dawned with the cold light sliding along the tall glass buildings. Amara sat in front of her laptop, her eyes glued to the image of James working in her office. The camera in the wine bottle was still working perfectly. She saw him on the phone, his expression tense, sometimes frowning, sometimes smirking. A man used to giving orders, but in his demeanor she saw the tiredness of a man who lived by control. She recorded every frame, every conversation that was caught on the microphone. Words like meridian, preemptive purchase, avoid SEC detection kept popping up. The pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. James was engaging in insider trading, just like the Kingsdale incident. Elliot walked in, setting his coffee mug down on the table. "I encrypted the data, but if you're going to release it, you need direct evidence voice, signature, or video." Amara nodded. "I know. I need to get closer." "Listen, Amara," Elliot said, his eyes worried. "James Cartwright is not a normal person. He has people in the government, and his own lawyers who live to clean up his messes. If you expose him, they'll twist everything to blame you." Amara chuckled. "I've been blamed once before, Elliot, and I survived. This time, I won't stay silent." She looked at the screen where James had just left the office. She had the feeling that there was a silent war going on between them, where every move was calculated. She didn't just want to clear her name. She wanted to end the system that looked down on people like her. Meanwhile, on the 52nd floor of Cartwright Capital, James was attending a shareholders' meeting. His presentation on the Meridian acquisition was coming to an end, and everyone was satisfied. He spoke fluently and convincingly, like a conductor conducting a huge financial orchestra. But in the middle of the meeting, his phone rang. It was a message from an unknown number. "Are you sure you can cover your tracks?" He frowned, looking around the table. No one seemed out of place. He deleted the message, but his hand remained clenched. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Could it be the girl after the meeting? He went straight to his office and gave Peter an order. "I want to check all the cameras in the office and the recent packages. Do it now." Peter looked at him, slightly alarmed. "Sir, is something wrong? Just in case." James replied, but his eyes were already flashing with caution. In the evening, Amara left Elliot's apartment and walked toward the train station. A light rain fell, the neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. In her bag was a USB drive containing all of Cartwright Capital's unusual trading data. Each step was heavy, both fearful and filled with determination. She recalled what her mother once said: "You can get knocked down, but never let others write your story." As she entered the station, she noticed someone following her. A man in a black coat and hat walked slowly but never took his eyes off her. She picked up her pace, her heart pounding. The walk down the train seemed endless. She turned down another exit, then stopped abruptly. "Who are you?" She turned, her voice strangely calm. The man was startled, but quickly regained his composure. "Miss Lewis, I am Mr. Cartwright's man. He wants to speak to you privately. Now. Now." Amara looked him straight in the eyes. In the dim light, she saw that his eyes were cold and unfriendly. "If he wants to talk, he knows where I work." With that, she turned away and boarded the train just in time to close the door. The man stopped, his eyes dark. She gasped and sat down on the chair, her heart still as tense as a bowstring. On the phone, she quickly texted Elliot, "He's already started to act. We have to go first." 2 days later, James received an anonymous email with an audio recording of himself discussing with his accountant the cover-up of the SEC. The note read, "Justice may be slow, but it finds its way." He slammed the phone down on the table. Her Peter rushed in. "What's the matter?" Sir James held up the phone. "Find her. I want to know where she is, what she's doing, who she's talking to. Use every resource." As Peter left, James stood still. The anger was no longer anger. It was fear turning to hatred. Since when had someone like him allowed himself to be pushed to this point? He looked out the window. The rain was beating against the glass. A thought flashed through his mind if she was threatening him. She had proof. And if she had proof, he had to get it before it leaked. That night, Amara received a text message from Elliot. "Meet me at my old apartment." Urgent. She didn't suspect a thing and rushed to get a cab. When she got there, the apartment was quiet. The door was ajar. She walked in and called out softly, "Elliot." There was no reply. In the dark room, there was only the sound of the ceiling fan slowly rotating. She took a few steps forward and saw Elliot's laptop open, with the words "File upload complete" on the screen. She touched the mouse, but just then, there were footsteps behind her. A man's voice said, "I think you're playing a dangerous game, Amara." She turned back. James stood there, in his black suit, his eyes cold as steel. "How did you get in here? The door is unlocked, and I just came to talk." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You're smart, Amara, but you don't understand people like me. We don't lose, we just change the rules." "Rules." She smiled faintly. "Your rules are lies and greed. Mine is the truth." James frowned, looking straight at her. "You think the truth will save you? No one cares. This world only listens to the rich. Then it's time they listen to someone else." She pulled out her phone and played the recording she had just captured from the camera hidden in the wine bottle. His voice rang out clearly. "Make sure they don't trace the information back to inside the SEC." James froze, then laughed dryly. "You think that thing can knock me out?" "No," she said, "but it's enough to start." At that moment, the phone rang. James looked at the screen. It was Peter. He picked up, his face pale. "What the article is out, who leaked it?" Amara looked at him, her eyes calm. "Probably Elliot." He was prepared. Whether I came or not, the truth would be revealed. He looked at her, his expression changing from anger to shock. "You don't understand. This will destroy me." "No," she whispered. "It will only expose you for who you really are." He stood still for a moment, then let out a sigh. "You won, Amara, but you will never have peace," she replied, her voice light as the wind. "I haven't had peace in a long time." She left the apartment and stepped out into the rain. James stood behind her, the streetlights casting a shadowy shadow over his face. For the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't pride. It was emptiness. In a small cafe, Elliot looked up at the wall-mounted TV. The news was playing billionaire James Cartwright accused of insider trading. SEC launches full-scale investigation. He smiled slightly. Amara sat across from him, silent. She wasn't happy, not gloating, just relieved, like someone who had just emerged from the shadows after many years. "Are you okay?" Elliot asked. "Fine," she said. "Just tired. You know," Elliot said softly. "You did what no one else would, not just for yourself, but for those who were trampled like you." Amara looked out, where the sky was beginning to lighten. "I just want them to know that no one should look down on someone just because they're lower in status." She took a deep breath, the smell of coffee mingling with the damp, post-rain air. Something flashed in her eyes, not of victory, but of freedom. 4 days after the news broke, New York was still buzzing. Newspapers carried bold headlines. James Cartwright charged with market manipulation, SEC opens full-scale investigation. Television footage of him leaving the Cartwright Capitol building, surrounded by reporters and flashbulbs, was non-stop. The pride in his face had vanished, replaced by a stiff, tired expression. Amara sat in a small cafe on the Hudson River, where the wind blew and the faint scent of salt hung in the air. She held the newspaper, looking at the photograph of James ducking through the gate. There was no sense of triumph, just a strange, deep silence. Elliot walked in, carrying a laptop and some papers. "They've frozen all of Cartwright Capital's accounts. Half the board has resigned." Amara nodded slightly. "And James, his lawyers are trying to negotiate with the SEC. But this is a big deal. They found a whole chain of subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands. If I'm right, he'll be formally charged in the next few days. You think he'll go to jail?" Elliot shrugged. "I don't know, but he'll never be the same again." She was silent for a moment, looking out at the river. "Elliot, do you ever feel empty after you get what you want?" He looked up. You feel empty. Yeah, I thought when justice comes, I'll be happy. But now, I'm just tired. Tired of knowing that the world always needs someone to pay the price so that others can see the truth. Elliot smiled sadly. Maybe because you fight not just to win, but to be understood, and the world rarely understands people like you. She smiled slightly, but her eyes remained distant. Meanwhile, on the empty 52nd floor, James sat alone in his office, the windows fogged by the rain. The room, once the center of power, was now suffocatingly silent. No more phones rang, no more people came in or out. It was just him and his old files, relics of a fallen empire. Peter walked in, placing a stack of papers on the table. Mr. Cartwright, the SEC requires your report by this afternoon. James nodded, his voice hoarse. Thank you, Peter. You can go. Peter hesitated. Sir, I just want to say, no matter what happens, I know you're the one who created so many opportunities for us. James looked at him, his eyes softening slightly. Peter, some opportunities are built on sand, and when the wind comes, nothing can stand. Go, before the storm takes you with it. Peter bowed slightly and left. The door closed, leaving James alone. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. Below, the traffic continued to roll by as if nothing had changed. But inside him, everything was broken. He recalls his early years, an ambitious 25-year-old sitting in a small Brooklyn apartment, drawing diagrams on the wall with a felt-tip pen. He believed that, with intelligence and hard work, he could change the world. But then came years of wealth and power, and with them came loss. He muttered to himself, I have forgotten why I started. That night, James left the building through a side door. He didn't go home, but walked down the street, his dark coat wet with rain. No one recognized him. No one wanted to. He stopped in front of a small diner, its neon sign flashing the glass ember. He walked slowly in. The bar was empty. The manager recognized him, nodded slightly but said nothing. James sat down at his old table, number 12, a familiar spot. Memories flooded back the night he had taunted the waitress, the night she had said the words that had kept him awake. He ordered a glass of red wine and sat still. After a few minutes, a soft voice said behind him, I didn't think you'd be back. Amara stood there, dressed in a simple uniform. The golden light fell on her face, making her eyes appear deep and calm. James turned back and looked at her for a long time. I didn't think you'd be working here anymore. She shrugged. I need the money to pay for my mother's hospital bills, and you probably need a quiet place to reminisce. He chuckled, a small, bitter laugh. You're right. I'm trying to remember what I lost along the way. Amara moved closer, setting her glass down on the table. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. He looked at her, his voice hoarse. Do you hate me? No, she said immediately. Without you, I would never have been strong enough to overcome my fear. There was a long pause, only the sound of rain falling against the glass. James bowed his head, his hand tightening on his glass. I used to think I had it all. Now I know. All I had was loneliness wrapped in gold. Maybe, she said, but people are not defined by their mistakes. What matters is what they do with them afterward. James looked up, meeting her eyes. What else do you think I can do start over? Not to get rich, but to fix what was broken, even if only in part. He was silent. For the first time, A rare light appeared in his eyes, not of power, but of regret. A week later, news broke. James Cartwright agrees to cooperate with the SEC and establishes a fund to support victims of financial market manipulation. No one understood why he changed his mind, only that he sold most of his assets, closed his company, and disappeared from the media. Amara read the news in the hospital, sitting next to her mother, now feeling better after her new treatment, held her hand and asked, "Are you thinking again?" "Amara," she smiled softly. "No, Mom. I was just thinking about someone, finally looking back at me." She smiled weakly. "Forgiveness is the lightest way to keep yourself." She nodded. "Yes, and sometimes forgiveness is not for them, but for yourself." Outside, sunlight streamed in through the windows, and for the first time in years, Amara felt at peace, not because someone had fallen, but because the truth had finally been told. That afternoon, she received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a check for $250,000 and a handwritten note for your mother. "Consider this a small part of what I owe the world. J.C." She looked at the check for a long time, then smiled slightly. No tears, no turmoil, just relief. She didn't cash the check right away. Instead, she folded it up and put it in the old notebook where she'd written down her investment formulas back at Kingsdale. On the last page, she added a line. "Sometimes, victory isn't about who's right, but about who's willing to look back." A few months later, in a small coastal town in Maine, James sat on a wooden bench overlooking the ocean. He had a beard, wore a wool coat, and held a notebook in his hand. Inside were plans for a new endowment fund, the only thing he still did every day. He did not contact anyone, but occasionally he received unsigned letters. The lines were soft, written in a familiar handwriting. "Hope you continue on the path you have chosen." He read, smiling slightly. There was a serenity in that smile that he had never known before, that of a man who had finally understood that no one is truly rich without compassion. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the smell of salt and the sound of waves. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift, as if he had finally found a resting place after a lifetime of struggling. The following spring, the first warm breezes blew through the streets of New York, carrying the scent of magnolias and the laughter of children. Amara walked slowly down 7th Avenue, a briefcase in her hand. She had officially quit her job at the Glass Ember 2 weeks ago. Her mother was recovering, and she'd received a job offer at a nonprofit that focused on empowering women of color in finance. It wasn't a lucrative job, but it made her smile every morning. She felt like she was doing something meaningful, no longer standing in the shadows. She stopped at the small coffee shop next to Bryant Park where she and Elliot often met. He was already sitting, his laptop open, his eyes following the text on the screen. When he saw her enter, he smiled. "You're right on time, as usual." Amara sat down. "Have you heard from Cartwright?" Elliot nodded. "Yes, I just read the new report. He's still in Maine. His foundation has helped over 200 people victims of financial fraud. Many said they never expected to receive compensation." Amara was silent. There was a mixture of surprise and contemplation in her eyes. "Is he really doing something good?" "It seems so," Elliot said, "though I think it's both redemption and self-discovery. Who knows? Maybe he's changed." She looked out the window, where the petals were drifting gently in the wind. People can change. But what I find strange is, why do I still think of him? Elliot looked at her. "Because you saw the part of him that he hid best. When you see someone better than they see themselves, it's hard to forget." She nodded slightly. maybe you're right. That evening, Amara came home late. When she opened the door, her mother was sitting on the couch, watching the news. The screen was showing a report on the Second Chance Fund, a charity founded by James Cartwright. The reporter was talking about a project to support scholarships for poor students, and the scene appeared James, with graying hair, shaking hands with a group of students in Maine. His face was kinder. His smile was no longer cold. Her mother turned back. "This man, is he the one who hurt you?" Amara smiled slightly. "Yes, but perhaps he is redeeming himself now." She nodded. "You only truly understand yourself when you have lost everything. Amara." She sat down next to her mother, and perhaps, in forgiving, you are free. A week later, Amara received an envelope in the mail. It was addressed to Maine. Inside was a letter, handwritten in steady but sincere handwriting. "Amara, you probably didn't think I'd write this letter, but there's something I need to say. Thank you for making me face myself. I used to believe that power was the only way to get respect, but you showed me that true respect comes from how we treat others. I lost more than I thought, but in return, I gained something that a lifetime cannot buy: peace." The Second Chance Fund was created with my remaining money, a portion of which bears her name, the Amara Scholarship, a scholarship for young women of color pursuing careers in finance. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope that one day you can see me as more than an enemy. I wish you to live free, the way you taught me what freedom is. James Cartwright. Amara put the letter down, her eyes tearing up, not because of pity, but because in those words she heard the truth: change does exist, and sometimes it begins with a seemingly deadlocked confrontation. She sat silently for a long time, then folded the letter and placed it on the small altar where there was a picture of her mother when she was young and a half-burned candle. "Mother," she said softly, "people can make mistakes, but they can also correct them." That summer, Amara was invited to attend the Foundation's first scholarship ceremony. It was held at a university in Boston. When she walked on stage, the lights dimmed and the room fell silent. "A few years ago," she began, "I was a person who was excluded from the financial world, not because I was bad, but because I did not belong to the powerful. But today, I stand here not to tell that story, but to say all doors can be opened if you do not give up believing in yourself." The entire auditorium erupted in applause. In the lower row, a silver-haired man in a hat and glasses watched silently. He didn't step forward, didn't introduce himself, just sat there. But when Amara looked down, their eyes met. It was a brief moment, but enough for both of them to understand that they were no longer opponents but two people overcoming their own darkness. After the ceremony, when everyone had left, Amara walked out into the garden behind the school. She saw the man standing by the pond, watching the ducks swim on the surface. She approached, her voice soft. "When did you get here?" James turned around, a tired but gentle smile on his face. "Since the beginning of the ceremony, I just wanted to hear you speak. And what do you think I think? If anyone is worthy enough to represent the name Second Chance, it is you." She was silent, looking at him. Time had made him look older, but his eyes were clearer, like someone who had just crossed the desert and found a stream. "You know," she said, "I used to think forgiveness was a weakness. Now I see it as the greatest strength." James nodded. "And sometimes that strength even saves those who don't deserve it." They both looked out at the lake, the afternoon light gently falling on the water. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard, mixed with the sound of the wind. A rare peace enveloped them. "Will you stay in America?" she asked. "I'm going to Africa," he replied. "There's a renewable energy project I want to help with. Maybe it's my last chance to make amends to the world." Amara smiled. "I trust you'll do well. Not because I'm any better," he said, "but because I understand now that money has no value unless it helps someone get up." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing more. When James left, he bowed slightly to her, a simple gesture, but one that meant a lifetime. She watched him, his figure gradually shrinking among the green trees. A strange feeling arose in her heart, both sad and warm, as if closing a long chapter. That night, when Amara returned to her apartment, she opened the window and looked out at the city lights stretching out to the horizon. She took out her old notebook, the one with her investment formulas, and added one last line. "Justice does not come from a court of law, but from the heart of man who recognizes and corrects. When we stop wanting to win, we begin to understand what is enough." She put down her pen and smiled slightly. Outside, the city was still bustling, but inside, everything was quiet. That autumn, New York was ablaze with golden leaves. The streets were covered in orange like the flow of time, flowing without anyone being able to hold it. Amara walked on the sidewalk, her thin coat fluttering in the wind. On her shoulder was an old brown leather bag. Inside was the manuscript of the book she was writing, a book called The Cost of Underestimation. 3 years have passed since she and James Cartwright faced off. The world has changed. She is no longer the humble waitress, nor the outcast. She is now Amara Lewis, a financial advisor, speaker, and founder of Empower Equity, an organization that helps women of color launch careers in finance, where every story begins with, "I thought I wasn't good enough until." She walked into the building where the panel was to take place. Inside, reporters, students, and investors were packed. Elliot, now the organization's communications director, approached and said quietly, "The room is full. Amara, there are reporters from Forbes and the Times." She smiled slightly. "Good. They'll hear the real story, not the one who wins, but the one who stands up." The stage lights came on. Amara stepped forward, her voice steady, warm, and steady. "Years ago, I was asked what seemed like a joke, 'Can you give me financial advice with this drink?' And that question changed my life." The room fell silent. She recounted her journey not with hatred, but with the calm of someone who knows the meaning of pain. We cannot control how others see us, but we can decide how we respond. Sometimes silence is a weapon. Sometimes kindness is the only power left. As she finished, she said slowly, "I would never wish what I went through on anyone else. But if you do, remember justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes from the little people who dare to believe they deserve the truth." The applause continued. Hundreds stood. Amara bowed her head, her heart feeling light as if she had put down an old burden. A month later, she received an invitation from Geneva Second Chance Fund, was nominated for an international award for its social contributions. And on the guest list of honor, there was her name, Amara Lewis. She sat in her office, rereading the old letter James had sent her years ago. The words were faded, but the meaning was still there. She looked out the window. The New York sky was pouring with golden sunshine. The flight to Switzerland was nearly 8 hours long. When the plane landed, she saw the snow-capped Alps, a sight that reminded her of rainy New York nights when she sat in her small apartment, shivering but refusing to collapse. At the ceremony, James Cartwright walked onto the stage with the organizers. He was much older, his hair was white, but his gait was still straight. When the lights came up, the room was dead silent. He saw her in the front row and gave her a slight nod, a nod of deep respect. No longer a gap between winners and losers. 3 years ago, James said, I was a living example that success without morals is failure in gold. And today, I stand here not to receive an award, but to say thank you to the person who made me face myself. Amara Lewis. You taught me that kindness is not weakness. It is the only force that can rebuild a person. The audience applauded. Amara felt her nose sting. She didn't cry, just smiled. After the ceremony, they met in the garden behind the hotel where the sunset was falling on Lake Lehman. James spoke first, his voice low and light as a breeze I'm leaving. Amara, the foundation has young people taken over now. I'm going to Africa, staying longer, not just advising, but living with them, building schools, teaching financial management. She looked at him, nodded. It's been a beautiful journey. He smiled. For the first time in my life, I don't measure value in money. They were both silent. In the distance, the lights reflected on the water. Amara began. You know, I used to think the end of the story was when justice prevailed. But now I understand the real end is when people change their hearts. James nodded. You're right. And maybe that's my new beginning, too. He pulled an old fountain pen from his pocket and handed it to her. This used to be mine. I want you to keep it to continue writing the stories I never had the courage to write. She took it, thanked him. They didn't shake hands, didn't say goodbye, just a long look, as if they both understood the paths ahead no longer crossed, but both led to the light. 1 year later, the New York winter sky is white. In the offices of Empower Equity, Amara is signing first copies of The Cost of Underestimation. On the cover, a silhouette of a woman holding a glass of water stands in the light coming in from a glass window. The book quickly became a phenomenon, not because of scandal or revenge, but because of its message. Every time you underestimate someone, you are putting yourself at risk of missing out on the greatest lesson. She looked out the window, where the snowflakes were falling steadily, and remembered her first day as a waitress delivering a glass of water to a billionaire. It all started with a joking question and ended with a journey of awakening. The phone rang. It was Elliot. Amara. Have you seen the news? James Cartwright died this morning in Kenya. They say he died in his sleep, next to a school under construction. She was still. A tear rolled down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the closure of a part of the past. He did what he said. She whispered. He fixed what was broken. Elliot was silent on the other end of the line. I think he would smile if he knew you were writing about that. Maybe, she replied, her voice soft. But the important thing is, we've all learned to forgive. That afternoon, Amara went to the old dock on the Hudson River, where she had sat during those desperate days. She took the fountain pen James had given her and wrote on a small piece of paper, "No one is born perfect, but everyone can choose how their story ends." She folded the paper and threw it into the river. The water carried it away, carrying all the pain, the wounds, and the unsaid words. She looked up at the silver-gray sky. Above, a ray of sunlight filtered through the thick clouds, reflecting off the water. And in that moment, she knew her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. In a world obsessed with wealth and appearances, this story reminds us of something money can't buy: humility, redemption, and the courage to see people for who they truly are. James Cartwright, a billionaire blinded by pride, learns that real value doesn't come from numbers on a screen, but from the hearts he once overlooked. And Amara Lewis, a woman once underestimated, proves that wisdom, grace, and integrity can shake even the tallest empires. It's a story about second chances, about the power of empathy to heal what arrogance once destroyed. It's a mirror for all of us, a question whispered deep inside: when was the last time you truly listened to someone beneath you? Maybe that's where real change begins, not in boardrooms or banks, but in moments of humanity. So, if this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect, to forgive, and to believe again in kindness, because no one is too rich to learn, and no one is too small to teach. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If you felt something today, even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to support more stories that remind us what it means to be human.